You'll regret this. My husband said it the way he said everything important, quietly, almost gently, like a doctor delivering a diagnosis he'd already decided I deserved. We were standing in the kitchen of the house his company built, the one with the marble island and the wine room he liked to show off to investors, and I had just set my suitcase down by the door. You have no idea what you're walking away from, Naomi. You have no idea what you're walking into either. He was right about one thing. He genuinely had no idea what I was walking into. What he didn't know, standing there in his $900 loafers, certain that I was leaving with nothing but wounded pride and an overnight bag, was that I had spent the last 2 years quietly building a case file thick enough to end everything he'd ever built. Every fraudulent appraisal, every falsified investor statement, every wire transfer routed through a shell company with his signature on it. All of it, documented, dated, and already sitting in the hands of a federal investigator who had been waiting for exactly this moment to move. He thought I was leaving empty-handed. I was leaving with the one thing he never once thought to guard, because he never once thought I was paying attention. Welcome back. Before we get into tonight's story, tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever been underestimated by someone who mistook your silence for weakness, stay with this one until the end, because sometimes the quietest person in the room is the only one who actually knows what's really going on. Let's get into it. My name is Naomi Reyes now. For 11 years, it was Naomi Wade, and before either of those, I was simply my father's daughter, which looking back, might have been the most important identity I ever carried, even though I spent most of my marriage letting it quietly disappear. My father, Arturo Reyes, was a forensic accountant, the kind who worked in the back offices of small firms his entire career rather than chasing partnership at some glittering downtown skyscraper, because he genuinely loved the work more than he loved the title. He used to say that numbers don't lie, but people build entire careers on making sure numbers never get the chance to tell the truth. He taught me to read a balance sheet before I could properly do long division, sitting at our kitchen table on Sunday afternoons, showing me how a single misplaced decimal, buried deep enough in a report nobody bothered to double-check, could quietly steal a family's entire retirement without anyone noticing for years. He wasn't flashy. He drove the same Honda for 18 years and refused to buy a bigger house even after his firm started doing well, because he believed, the way some people believe things down in their bones, that the appearance of success and the actual substance of integrity were two entirely different things, and only a fool confused one for the other. He used to keep a small framed quote on his office wall, something he'd typed himself on an old typewriter long before I was born, and taped inside a second-hand frame he'd found at a flea market. It read, simply, "The truth doesn't care how inconvenient the timing is." As a girl, I thought it was just something fathers hung on walls. As an adult, sitting in Preston's home office at 4 a.m. staring at numbers that told a story I badly didn't want to be true, I understood, for the first time, exactly how much weight that small, cheaply framed sentence had actually been carrying my whole life. My mother died when I was 14, and my father raised me largely alone after that, teaching me his trade the way some fathers teach their children to fish or garden, patiently on weekends, treating every lesson like it actually mattered. By the time I finished my accounting degree and earned my CPA license at 24, I understood forensic auditing the way most people understand their own native language, instinctively, completely, without needing to consciously think through the grammar of it at all. I met Preston Wade at 26, at an industry mixer I'd only attended because a colleague dragged me there, standing awkwardly near the appetizer table, while men in expensive suits networked around me with a confidence I found, at the time, genuinely magnetic. Preston was 31 then, already running his own boutique real estate development firm, charming in the specific, practice way of a man who had learned early that charisma opened doors ambition alone couldn't force. He found me interesting, he told me later, because I was the only person at that entire event who asked him a real question about his numbers instead of complimenting his vision. "Most people just want to hear about the skyline," he said over the dinner he asked me to that same week. "You wanted to know how I was financing it. Nobody's ever done that on a first date before." I should have understood, even then, that the question itself was a kind of foreshadowing, though it would take me the better part of a decade to fully understand exactly what it was foreshadowing. We married 2 years later. In a small ceremony my father walked me through with tears he tried, unsuccessfully, to hide. Preston's family, old money from a shipping fortune 3 generations removed from actually working for any of it, attended with the specific, gracious condescension of people who believed they were doing everyone else a favor simply by showing up. Preston's mother, Diane, told me at the reception, in a tone she clearly believed was a compliment, that I seemed like exactly the kind of steady, practical woman a man like Preston needed behind the scenes. Behind the scenes. I didn't fully register, at 28 and thoroughly in love, exactly how much that phrase was about to define the next 11 years of my life. For the first few years, the marriage genuinely felt like a partnership. Preston's firm, Wade Development Group, was small then, ambitious but underfunded, and I quietly began handling the company's internal books almost by accident, noticing an inconsistency in a contractor invoice during a dinner conversation, and simply fixing it before either of us thought to make the arrangement formal. It became a habit, then a routine, then, eventually, the actual unspoken architecture holding Preston's growing empire together. All of it done without a title, without a salary, without my name appearing on a single official document, because Preston preferred, he explained early on, to keep family matters and business matters cleanly separated, at least on paper. I told myself that made sense. I told myself a lot of things made sense during those years that, looking back now, I understand were simply the quiet, gradual erosion of a woman convincing herself that being essential and being valued were the same thing. Wade Development Group grew rapidly across our first 5 years of marriage, 3 projects becoming 11, a small regional firm becoming, by industry reputation at least, one of the most aggressive rising developers in the state. Preston was profiled in business journals, invited onto panels, photographed at ribbon cuttings with the specific practiced smile of a man who had decided, somewhere along the way, that his own myth was simply another asset worth carefully managing. The cracks, when I look back on them honestly, started appearing around year 6, not in our marriage exactly, though certainly there too, but in the books themselves. Small inconsistencies at first, easy to dismiss individually. A contractor invoice that didn't quite match the corresponding permit filing. A property appraisal that came in considerably higher than comparable listings in the same neighborhood, conveniently high enough to secure a loan that otherwise wouldn't have cleared underwriting. An investor statement showing returns on a project that, according to the actual construction timeline sitting in a different file entirely, hadn't even broken ground yet. I brought the first discrepancy to Preston directly, the way I always had, expecting the same easy collaboration that had defined our early years together. He waved it off, calling it a rounding error from the appraisal firm, nothing worth losing sleep over. I believed him, because believing him had, by that point, become its own kind of habit, deeply worn into the shape of our marriage the way water wears a groove into stone. But the discrepancies kept appearing, and they kept getting larger, and somewhere around year 8, sitting alone in Preston's home office late one night reconciling a set of investor disclosures against the company's actual internal ledgers, I finally allowed myself to see, fully and without the comfortable fog of a decade's worth of practiced denial, exactly what I was looking at. Preston wasn't making rounding errors. He was running a scheme, patient and deliberate, using inflated appraisals to secure loans considerably larger than his actual projects justified, then using a portion of that excess capital to pay off earlier investors on older projects, the exact structure, I recognized with a cold, sinking clarity, of a fraud my own father had once described to me at our kitchen table decades earlier, back when I was still learning long division. He'd called it, back then, simply theft with better paperwork. I spent that entire night tracing the pattern backward, project by project, the way my father had taught me to trace any inconsistency, starting from the most recent, and working methodically toward the earliest record I could find. The Maple Ridge development, financed 2 years earlier against an appraisal nearly 40% above what 3 comparable properties in the same neighborhood had actually sold for that same season. The Brenner Street project, showing investor distributions on returns that, according to the county's own public permit records, corresponded to a construction phase that hadn't even been approved yet at the time the statements went out. Each discrepancy, taken alone, might have passed as an honest mistake, the kind of thing an overwhelmed developer's office simply got wrong under deadline pressure. Taken together, laid out in the careful chronological order my father had trained into me since childhood, they formed something considerably more deliberate, a pattern too consistent, too precisely timed to the exact moments Preston's company needed a cash infusion, to be anything other than intentional. I didn't confront him that night. I sat alone in that office until nearly 4 in the morning, staring at numbers that told a story considerably uglier than the one my husband had spent a decade telling everyone else, including me. And I made a decision that would define the following 2 years of my life in ways I couldn't fully understand yet, sitting there in the dark. I decided I wasn't going to simply divorce him and walk away quietly. I decided I was going to document everything, patiently, thoroughly, the way my father had taught me, until I had a case airtight enough that no amount of Preston's charm or Preston's lawyers could talk their way around it. For the next 2 years, I lived a kind of double life that still, even now, feels almost impossible to fully describe. To the outside world, and increasingly uncomfortably, to Preston himself, I remained exactly the quiet, practical wife his mother had once approvingly described, handling the company's books without a title, attending the galas, smiling in the photographs, saying almost nothing in rooms full of investors who had no idea the woman refilling their champagne glasses understood their entire financial exposure better than their own attorneys did. Underneath that quiet performance, I was building something else entirely. I reached out, carefully and anonymously at first, to a forensic accounting colleague of my father's, a retired SEC examiner named Walter Grunwald, who had mentored my father decades earlier and had, in his own retirement, developed a reputation for helping whistleblowers navigate exactly the kind of documentation trail I was slowly assembling. Walter connected me, eventually, with an attorney named Renata Cho, who specialized in securities fraud whistleblower cases, a sharp, careful woman who understood, better than anyone else in my life at that point, exactly how much personal risk I was taking on simply by continuing to show up in my own kitchen every morning. You understand, Renata told me, during our first meeting in a coffee shop 2 counties away from anywhere Preston might recognize either of us, that if this comes out before we're ready, before every piece is documented and corroborated independently, he'll simply claim you fabricated it out of spite during a difficult divorce. Juries are skeptical of angry spouses, Naomi, no matter how good their spreadsheets are. Then we make sure it's not just my spreadsheets, I told her, and meant it. Over the following 2 years, I built exactly that. Every fraudulent appraisal Preston used to secure financing, cross-referenced against independent property valuations I quietly commissioned under a consulting entity Renata helped me establish, one that carried no visible connection back to me at all. Every investor statement showing returns that didn't match actual construction progress, photographed, dated, and matched against public permit records and satellite imagery of the actual physical sites. Every wire transfer moving money from newer investor accounts to cover shortfalls on older, underperforming projects. The exact structural signature, Walter confirmed grimly, of a Ponzi-adjacent scheme that left unchecked, was mathematically guaranteed to collapse eventually, taking down everyone still invested when it finally did. I found, buried 3 years back in records Preston had never once imagined I'd look closely enough to notice, evidence of an affair as well, not with any single person consistently, but a pattern of relationships with junior associates and investor liaisons that Preston seemed to treat with the same casual, entitled confidence he brought to everything else in his life, certain. The way certain men become certain after enough uninterrupted success, that consequences were simply a category of problem that happened to other, lesser people. I documented that too, not because Renata needed it for the fraud case, but because some quiet, wounded part of me needed to fully understand exactly what I'd actually been married to for a decade, once the fog of practice denial finally, completely lifted. The hardest part of those 2 years wasn't the documentation itself, tedious and exhausting as it was, working late into the night after Preston had gone to sleep, meeting Renata and Walter in coffee shops far from anywhere familiar, learning to speak in the careful, deliberately vague language of someone building a case they couldn't yet reveal they were building. The hardest part was the performance, showing up every single day to a marriage I now understood, with total clarity, was built on numbers as false as everything else Preston had ever shown the world. There were nights I nearly told him everything, some exhausted, wounded part of me still hoping, Against all the evidence steadily accumulating in a secure file with Renata's office, that confronting him directly might somehow produce a version of accountability I could actually live with. Renata talked me out of it every single time. Gently but firmly, reminding me exactly what men like Preston did when cornered without an airtight case already sealed against them. They didn't confess. They destroyed evidence, moved assets, and made sure the person who'd caught them paid a price steep enough to discourage anyone else from ever trying. When we're ready, she told me, more times than I could count, you won't have anywhere to move the pieces before the board comes down on all of them at once. That's the entire point of patience, Naomi. It's not about waiting to feel less angry. It's about waiting until he has no exits left. There was one evening, roughly 14 months into the documentation, that came closer than any other to unraveling everything before it was ready. Preston came home unexpectedly early from a site visit. While I sat at the kitchen table with a folder of independently commissioned property appraisals spread across the surface, comparison documents I'd had no legitimate reason to possess under my own name, I heard his car in the driveway with barely 90 seconds of warning, and I remember, with a clarity that still occasionally returns to me in dreams, the specific cold calm that settled over my hands as I swept the folder into a grocery bag and shoved it into the pantry behind a row of canned tomatoes, just as his key turned in the lock. "Working on something?" he asked, glancing at the empty table, mildly curious rather than suspicious, the particular careless curiosity of a man who had simply never once considered that his wife might be capable of hiding something from him. "Just going through old recipes," I told him, and he accepted it without a second thought, the same easy, unquestioning way he'd accepted almost everything I'd ever told him across 11 years of marriage. I sat with him through dinner that night with my heart still hammering, understanding, more completely than I had at any earlier point in the process, exactly how much was actually riding on my ability to keep performing a version of myself that no longer fully existed. The federal referral. Once Walter helped me submit the completed case file to the SEC's whistleblower office, took another 4 months to formally activate an investigation. For months during which I continued, somehow, to sit across from Preston at dinner, to attend his industry galas, to smile in photographs beside a man who had started, over those final months, treating me with an increasing, careless contempt I now understood was simply the natural byproduct of a decade spent believing I would never fully understand or matter to the empire he'd built. It was during those final months, watching him grow bolder and crueler in equal measure, certain the woman across the dinner table posed no threat he needed to take seriously, that I finally, fully decided the marriage itself needed to end, separately and entirely from whatever the federal investigation eventually produced. I didn't need to stay married to him to finish building the case. I simply needed, for my own sake, to stop pretending I still wanted to be his wife. I told him on a Tuesday evening, in the kitchen of the house his company had built, the marble island gleaming under lights he'd once proudly told an interviewer cost more than most people's entire home renovation budgets. I told him plainly, without accusation, without mentioning anything about the case still quietly moving through the SEC's investigative pipeline, simply that I was leaving, that the marriage had been over for longer than either of us had probably been willing to admit, and that I'd already secured an apartment across town. Preston's reaction moved through several stages in the space of about 90 seconds, disbelief first, genuine and almost comical in its speed, then a kind of wounded, performative confusion, as though I were the one behaving unreasonably, and finally, settling into the expression I'd come to recognize, over 11 years, as the one he wore whenever he believed he still held every meaningful advantage in a room. "You'll regret this," he said, setting down his glass of scotch with the exaggerated calm of a man who had never once, in his entire adult life, genuinely believed anyone could actually walk away from him and land on their feet. "You have no idea what you're walking away from, Naomi. This house. This life. Everyone we know. You think you're going to just start over at 39 with what? Your little bookkeeping hobby? You've spent 11 years riding on what I built. You have no idea what you're walking into either." I remember standing there with my suitcase already packed by the door, feeling something settle in my chest that wasn't anger exactly, though there was plenty of that too, underneath. It was something closer to a strange, quiet certainty, the specific calm of a person who understands, completely, that the man standing in front of her, so confident in his advantage, genuinely has no idea what advantage actually means anymore. You're probably right that I have no idea what I'm walking into, I told him, picking up my suitcase. But I know exactly what you're about to walk into, Preston. I just don't think you're going to enjoy finding out. He laughed at that, a short, dismissive sound, already reaching for his phone before I'd even made it to the door. Already, I understood later, composing whatever careless message he intended to send someone about his soon-to-be ex-wife's dramatic little exit line. I moved into the apartment Renata had helped me quietly arrange months earlier under my maiden name. And for the first time in longer than I could clearly remember, I slept without the low, constant hum of tension that had, I realized only in its absence, been sitting in my chest for years without my fully registering its weight. The federal case activated formally 6 weeks later. I wasn't in the room when it happened, though Renata called me the moment it did, her voice carrying a particular careful satisfaction I'd never heard from her before. Across 2 years of careful, patient meetings in coffee shops and secure conference rooms, federal investigators, working from the case file I'd spent 2 years building, executed a coordinated set of subpoenas, and in Preston's specific case, a search warrant for Wade Development Group's downtown offices, arriving on an ordinary Thursday morning with a thoroughness that, Renata told me, left even seasoned agents on the case quietly impressed by how completely the documentation trail had already been assembled before they'd even opened their first file. Preston's world, built so carefully across more than a decade on appraisals that didn't match reality and investor statements describing returns that had never actually existed, began collapsing with a speed that, even having spent 2 years anticipating exactly this outcome, genuinely surprised me once it actually began. 2 of his largest investors, reviewing the SEC's initial findings alongside their own attorneys, filed civil suits within the same week federal charges were formally announced, seeking to recover funds now clearly, undeniably shown to have been misappropriated to cover shortfalls on entirely separate, underperforming projects. Wade Development Group's primary lender, reviewing the same findings, called in every outstanding loan simultaneously, a move that, without the fraudulent appraisals propping up the company's actual collateral value, Preston's firm had absolutely no realistic way to satisfy. The board of the industry association that had, only 18 months earlier, named Preston their Rising Developer of the Year, quietly rescinded the honor in a brief, carefully worded statement that made no direct reference to the ongoing federal investigation. Though everyone in the industry understood exactly what it meant regardless. Preston called me 11 times in the first week after the search warrant, messages ranging from furious accusation to something considerably closer to genuine panic. I answered exactly none of them, on Renata's careful advice, letting her office field every piece of communication instead, a decision that, looking back now, probably preserved more of my own composure across those first difficult weeks than almost anything else I did. He did finally reach me directly, nearly 3 weeks after the search warrant, showing up unannounced at the small accounting practice I'd quietly begun rebuilding under my own name, Reyes Forensic Consulting, a modest office 2 floors above a bakery that, on ordinary days, filled the whole building with the smell of fresh bread. He looked, when he walked through my door that afternoon, considerably smaller than the man who had once told me, with such total careless confidence, exactly what I had no idea I was walking away from. His suit was still expensive, but it hung differently on him now, the particular deflation of a man who has spent 3 weeks discovering exactly how much of his own confidence had been borrowed from an empire that no longer existed to prop it up. "You did this," he said, not quite a question, standing in my small waiting room while my one part-time assistant quietly excused herself to the back office. "The federal case. The timing. You did this." "I documented what was already true, Preston," I said, keeping my voice level, the way Renata had coached me, more than once, to keep it. "I didn't fabricate a single number. Every figure in that case file came directly from your own company's records. If you're looking for who's actually responsible for what's happening to you right now, I'd start by looking considerably closer to home than my office." 11 years, he said, his voice cracking in a way I'd genuinely never heard from him before, not once, across an entire marriage built on his own careful, unshakable performance of control. 11 years, And you were building a case against me the entire time. Since when? Since I found the first real discrepancy. I told him honestly, because there was nothing left at that point to protect by lying. Somewhere around year 8. I gave you every chance to fix it quietly, Preston. I brought you the first inconsistency myself, remember? You called it a rounding error and told me not to lose sleep over it. He had no answer for that, because there wasn't one that didn't require admitting something about himself he had spent his entire adult life refusing to look at directly. You could have just left, he said finally, quieter now. Divorced me. Taken whatever settlement you were entitled to. Why do this? Why spend 2 years of your life documenting my downfall instead of just walking away with what you deserved? I considered that question seriously, because it deserved a serious answer. Even standing there in a small waiting room above a bakery, facing a man who had once told me I had no idea what I was walking away from. Because a settlement would have made me comfortable, Preston. It wouldn't have made anyone whole. There are people who invested their retirement savings in projects that never actually existed the way your statements claim they did. There are contractors who did real work and got paid with money that should have gone to protecting other people's investments instead. A quiet divorce protects me. It doesn't protect them. And somewhere along the way, I decided I'd rather be the kind of person who protected them. Even if it cost me 2 years of my life I'll never get back. Preston's trial, when it finally came, 18 months later, drew exactly the kind of extensive regional business press coverage his earlier career had once courted so eagerly. Though the coverage now carried a considerably different tone than the glowing magazine profiles of his rising years. Prosecutors, working from the documentation I'd spent 2 years assembling, laid out a case so thoroughly corroborated across independent sources that Preston's own defense attorney, according to reporting that emerged later, had privately advised him to accept a plea agreement months before the trial ever began. Advice Preston, characteristically, had refused to take seriously until it was considerably too late to matter. I testified on the 9th day of the trial, called by the prosecution to walk the jury through the exact chronology of discovery, from the first inconsistency I'd brought to Preston directly at year 8, through the 2 years of careful, independent documentation that followed. Preston's attorney tried, during cross-examination, to paint the entire case as the elaborate revenge of a bitter, betrayed wife, suggesting I had fabricated or exaggerated discrepancies out of anger over the affairs I'd also discovered along the way. Isn't it true, Mrs. Wade, he said, still using the name I'd already legally set aside, that you had every personal motivation to make your husband's business practices look considerably worse than they actually were? Every figure in my case file came directly from Wade Development Group's own internal records and independently verified public documents. I told him, keeping my voice level the way Renata had coached me through months of preparation. I didn't need to exaggerate anything. The numbers were already damning on their own. I simply organized them clearly enough that a jury could see what I saw. Several jurors, I noticed, were nodding slightly by the time I stepped down from the stand. The jury deliberated for just under 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on every count: securities fraud, wire fraud, and a pattern of financial conduct. The judge, in her sentencing remarks, described as a sustained, deliberate betrayal of trust extended by people who had believed, in good faith, in a vision that had never actually been built on anything solid at all. Preston was sentenced to 9 years in federal prison, along with a restitution order requiring repayment, to whatever extent his remaining, considerably diminished assets allowed, of the funds misappropriated from his investors. His mother, Diane, sat in the courtroom gallery throughout the entire trial, her expression, by the final day, carrying none of the gracious condescension I remembered from our wedding reception all those years earlier, replaced instead by something that looked, to my genuine surprise, considerably closer to grief than anger. She approached me once outside the courthouse, on the final day of the trial, and said something I still think about, more than I expected to, all these years later. I always thought you were simply steady, she told me, her voice carrying none of its old, easy condescension. I never once considered that steady and dangerous might be the same thing in the right person. I'm sorry for what I said to you, all those years ago, about the kind of woman a man like Preston needed. I think, in the end, he needed exactly the kind of woman I dismissed you as being. He just never deserved her. I didn't know in that moment quite what to say to that, so I simply thanked her and let her walk away. What I built, in the years following the trial, was not primarily a story about revenge completed, though there was undeniably a kind of quiet justice in watching a man who had told me I had no idea what I was walking away from discover exactly how thoroughly he'd misjudged the woman he'd spent a decade dismissing as simply steady and practical. It was more than anything a story about reclaiming a professional identity I'd quietly set aside for over a decade in service of someone else's carefully managed myth. Reyes Forensic Consulting, the small practice I'd started above a bakery with a single part-time assistant, grew steadily over the following years, built almost entirely on referrals from attorneys like Renata, who understood exactly how rare it was to find a forensic accountant with both the technical skill to trace a fraud through 6 layers of shell companies and the lived, personal understanding of exactly what it costs a person to finally, fully see what they've spent years refusing to look at directly. I specialized, deliberately, in cases involving financial abuse within marriages and family businesses, working with spouses, mostly women though not exclusively, who had spent years quietly managing books for partners who never once thought to give them a title, a salary, or genuine credit for the actual architecture holding an entire enterprise together. I understood something about those clients, sitting across from me in my small office above the bakery, that most forensic accountants, however technically skilled, simply couldn't fully access. I understood exactly what it felt like to be essential and dismissed in the very same breath, for years at a stretch, until dismissal itself started to feel like the only identity anyone was willing to offer you. One of my earliest clients, a woman named Priya who had spent 19 years managing the books for her husband's chain of auto dealerships without ever once appearing on a single piece of company paperwork, cried in my office during our first meeting, not from grief exactly, but from the specific, disorienting relief of finally being believed by someone who understood, in her bones rather than just her training, exactly what she was describing. Everyone kept telling me I was imagining it, she said. That I was just bad with money, that the discrepancies were my mistakes, not his. You're the first person who looked at my spreadsheets and told me I wasn't crazy. I kept a framed photo of the settlement letter she eventually received. The first case my small practice fully closed on its own, in the top drawer of my desk, not to display it, but simply to remember, on the difficult days, exactly why the work mattered. My father, watching all of this unfold from his own quiet retirement, 3 states away, but calling every Sunday afternoon the way he always had, told me once, not long after Preston's sentencing, that he'd known something was wrong in my marriage years before I ever called him with the full truth of it. How? I asked him, genuinely curious. Because you stopped asking me questions about the work, he said simply. For years, you'd call me every time you found something interesting in a set of books, the way we used to talk on Sunday afternoons when you were a girl. Then you stopped. I figured, eventually, either you'd lost interest in the work entirely, which never seemed like you, or you'd found something you didn't know how to talk to me about yet. He paused. I'm glad it was the second one. I'm glad you finally called. 3 years after Preston's sentencing, I stood in a small conference room in my now considerably larger office, no longer above the bakery, though I kept a standing weekly order from them out of a loyalty that had nothing to do with practicality anymore. Addressing a room full of new associates I'd hired to help handle the growing caseload the practice could no longer manage with just myself and one part-time assistant. People will tell you, I said, looking out at faces that reminded me, in ways I found I didn't entirely mind, of the plain, unglamorous version of myself who had once sat at a kitchen table learning to read a balance sheet from a father who genuinely believed the work mattered more than the title attached to it. That forensic accounting is simply about finding the number that doesn't match. That's true as far as it goes. But the harder part, the part nobody teaches you in any certification course, is learning to trust what you're seeing even when the person benefiting most from you not seeing it is someone you love. I spent 2 years of my life learning that lesson the hard way. I'd like to help you learn it a little faster than I did. After the meeting, walking out into the late afternoon light with Renata, who had stayed on as both my closest professional collaborator and over the years, something considerably closer to a genuine friend, I paused for a moment on the sidewalk outside my building, The way I still occasionally found myself doing at the end of days that felt, in their own quiet way, like the entire point of everything that had happened. You never did tell me, Renata said, whether you regret any of it. The 2 years of hiding what you knew, staying married to him that whole time, showing up to those galas, smiling in those photographs while you were building the exact case that would eventually end everything he'd built. I considered the question seriously, the way I considered most things now. I regret that it took me 8 years to see clearly what was happening, I said finally. I regret the version of myself who kept explaining away every inconsistency, because believing him was simply easier than confronting what believing him was actually costing me. But the 2 years of documentation, no. I don't regret those at all. They taught me exactly what I needed to know, about him, about the people who trusted him, and mostly, in the end, about myself. I looked back toward my office building, at the small brass plaque by the door that simply read Reyes Forensic Consulting. Nothing more. He told me I had no idea what I was walking away from. He was right about that, actually. I had no idea I was walking away from a marriage I should have left years earlier, toward a version of myself I'd been quietly setting aside since the day I agreed to keep my own name off the company's books to protect his careful separation between family matters and business matters. I smiled, small and genuine. Turns out that separation only ever protected one of us. I'm glad I finally figured out which one. And that is the whole story. A man who told his wife she had no idea what she was walking away from. Standing in a kitchen he was certain would always belong to him. A woman who spent 2 quiet years learning exactly what he was actually building, patiently, methodically, the way her father had once taught her to read a balance sheet at their kitchen table decades earlier. And a truth, carefully documented and carefully hidden, that outlasted every assumption a confident man had ever made about the quiet woman he'd spent a decade underestimating. If tonight's story moved you, I want you to remember one thing before you go. The people we dismiss as simply steady, simply practical, simply behind the scenes, are so rarely as simple as we've decided to believe. Sometimes the quietest person in the room isn't the one with the least power. She's simply the one who understands, better than anyone else watching, exactly how much power patience actually holds. If you enjoyed tonight's story, hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who love a reveal exactly like this one. And here's my question for you tonight. If you were Naomi, would you have spent 2 years quietly building the case the way she did? Or would you have confronted him the moment you found the first real discrepancy? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss the next story. I'll see you in the next one.